We're now over a month into the Iran war, and nobody really knows how this thing is going to play out. One thing that is certain, however, is that the war itself has seismically changed the politics of Iran internally, and in a plethora of ways, some of which are visible, others less so. Earlier today, I spoke to Sina Toosi, a senior fellow at the Centre for International Policy. I began by asking him what Donald Trump meant by his threat to destroy Iranian civilization.
It makes me think of, and this is probably not how Trump is thinking about it, but like Samuel Huntington's thesis of Clash of Civilizations. But at the root of that, there is amongst this class in America, among the ruling class of America, and among the foreign policy establishment, and amongst American hardliners, that this idea of they are supreme. They are, it's a supremacist ideology, and they do view things in these kind of racist terms, and that's long been the case. I mean, if you dig into the history of U.S. foreign policy, at roots, there is an element of white supremacy and, uncompromising dominance and hegemony over the world. So Trump is really just the most brazen, naked form of that, in my opinion. Trump is someone who, maybe American foreign policy has long been aggressive, interfering in other parts of the world, toppling governments, doing, many of these things that he threatens, now, and he's doing now. But the difference is Trump is just so much more explicit about it, whereas even, the Bush administration or Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, I mean, they weren't that different ultimately in their war on terror and their kind of, what underpinned that war, the kind of neoconservative ideologues who justified that war, people like Bernard Lewis. And, at the root of that is this idea of, racial supremacy, that the Islamic world is something that is inferior. So I think that's how I just initially, to your question, that, just off the top of my head, and, for Trump, that plays to his base, I think, for Trump, we've seen that he is someone who, when he came onto the political stage on a national level in 2016, it was all, he was a demagogue. He was someone who, castigated Mexican Americans in Mexico and talked in all these racialized terms and, said, this rhetoric is not new for him. It's like they're sending their, rapists and murderers. They're not sending their best, about Hispanics and Latin Americans. So this is his politics. His politics is of demonizing others, scapegoating others, and, kind of white working class grievance. It used to be, but now it's more like this kind of elitist, I would say probably white ruling class, or, I mean, we can dig into that, but, there's obviously this war is not serving the interests of the work, anybody amongst the middle and working classes in America, I would argue. So he's really betrayed some of those electoral promises that he had given in the past.
I mean, that's a really interesting response. You say that that's an expression almost of supremacist politics, and you're saying that within US foreign policy goes back a long way. To my mind, I'm thinking Teddy Roosevelt. Do you think that Trump is the most explicit with regards to that language, and not on the substance, because you're right, actually, the substance is in many ways similar to Wolfowitz and the neocons. But in terms of the rhetoric, do you think it's actually the most overt expression of a European or white supremacist politics we've had since Teddy Roosevelt? Because, you're going back a century there, right? So it is very much something of a throwback. That might be a strange question, I know, but it is a weird thing to be talking about civilizations and sending them back to the Stone Age. This is not even really stuff we were hearing in the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think, it really harkens back to European colonialism. And, in America also has a tradition of being opposed to European imperialism and colonialism, and especially with, you mentioning Teddy Roosevelt in that era, I recall just in my own studies and readings that, there was anti-imperialist politics at that time, and there was politicians and the kind of leftist leaders who came to the fore during that time. I believe Eugene Debs was around that time. But anyways, I'm not an expert on that period of history, but yeah, I think, but at the same time, while that strand has existed in America is obviously a country of contradictions, and this other strand of, slavery, harkening back to this more aggressive form of imperialism that was taking roots among some in America, or some Americans who wanted to also emulate that European model. And we've seen America's forays back in that era in the early 20th century, in Latin America, in the Philippines, even in the world wars. A lot of that racialized, obviously, logic, and not logic, illogic, but that racialized ideology was also very prevalent, obviously, in America, goes without saying. So I think Trump is, he touches on a strand of politics in America that has always existed, but I mean, obviously it's not black and white. America has also this very pluralistic strand of, obviously, of politics and history, but he represents this kind of the more naked imperialism and wanting to whack other countries over the head with a stick, not even necessarily, talk softly and carry a big stick, but, whack them over the head with a stick, take what we can. And so in many ways, it's new in the modern era, but, American foreign policy, even in the modern era, has been quite uncompromising to people, to states and nationalities and nations, I should say, that do not kind of acquiesce to its hegemony.
I'm reminded of I think it was Terror Tuesday, right, during Obama, where basically every Tuesday it was bumping off people just to whack up the numbers of people who were terrorists. And, that sounds like something that's very Trump coded, right? Terror Tuesday, but it was happening under Obama. You've said that Iran isn't backing down. What does winning look like for Iran in this conflict? What would be the settlement where actually Tehran and the IGC say, yeah, you know what, we're stopping. We're not going to attack Saudi anymore. We're not going to attack the UAE anymore. What are their key red lines?
The policy that preceded this war, that this war occurred in the context of, was this maximum pressure campaign against Iran that was openly aimed at destroying the economy. We know, according to the economic data and great research that has been done, that millions of Iranians have fallen out of the middle class since 2018, have fallen into poverty. There's been, at times, shortages of medicine. The currency has greatly depreciated. So this has been, Iran has been in that economic penalty box for a long time now. And Iran has also been in the box of having the threat of war hanging over it, which has obviously had debilitating economic effects, and has created this atmosphere where for the longest time, Iran was in a state of neither war nor peace. So there was this kind of covert war, hybrid war being waged against it. There was the June war, followed by this 7-8 month period of high tensions, a threat of war again. And Iran can't have economic development that it needs under these circumstances. So when it comes to what kind of end state Iran is looking at towards this war, is to come out of this box, come out of this penalty box that it's been in, the economic warfare, the threat of war dangling over it. So right now we're seeing that in these proposals and counter proposals that are being reported in the media, the Iranians are saying that they don't want a temporary ceasefire. They want a permanent end to the hostilities. They want an end that could bring them an economic horizon, that they can emerge from this war, not like 1991, Saddam Hussein's Iraq after the Gulf War, which, the Iraqi regime survived that war, but it was just under immense economic sanctions after that. There was a no-fly zone over much of the country, and it really laid the stage for another war down the line that destroyed the country even more. So they, their calculation in this war, and, I'm reading Iranian strategists every day, kind of their media there, trying to get an idea of what they're saying, is that, the Strait of Hormuz is their key leverage here, that they've had, it has given them a means to pressure the US and the global economy in a way that they never had before. Whereas previously, US threats against Iran would have these debilitating effects on its economy. They would depreciate the value of the rial, the Iranian currency. Now we're in a scenario where Trump has to placate the markets during the week, try to talk about diplomacy to prevent, the stock market from sharply declining, from oil prices from sharply increasing. And so this is a scenario, this is a kind of situation that Iran is trying to preserve, that it's shown this capability to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, and that if this war ends without Iran losing this capability, and I can get into the scenarios how this war can end, but if it ends with this capability still being there, and if it's on Iran's terms that ships are then going, then Iran will have shown that this is a leverage that it holds, and that in the future that could negate the risk of war again. That if in the future Netanyahu or Trump threatens Iran or tries to move towards military action, we'll immediately start seeing these negative market effects and economic knock-on effects. And they threw everything they had at Iran, and they couldn't stop this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So that in itself can usher in a new regional order where the Gulf states, other neighboring countries will, for their own interests, have to accept a situation where they have to work with Iran, that they have to engage with Iran, and that ultimately the Iranian goal is to tie its stability and its prosperity to the stability and prosperity of the Persian Gulf. And so that is the conclusion that they're looking for. Now, Trump is kind of in a strategic deadlock where he had this regime change ambition. He hit a wall against that. Now the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted and closed, and there's no real military option, I would argue, for that to be ended, because Iran has the entire northern coastline of the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz is very narrow, and all it takes, this isn't a closure that Iran has been hitting every tanker, that Iran has been mining the Strait or mining the Persian Gulf. It could reach there, but it is a closure based on the risk analysis and risk aversion of the tanker companies, of these local economies, that if there's the mere risk of getting hit by an Iranian missile, that there's the mere risk of hitting a mine, that they're not moving those ships, and that has been effective, and the strait is de facto shut down. And so that is something that Iran is going to be able to hold despite massive military escalation. So Trump right now, because he's hit a wall, he's threatening all these insane threats, civilization ending. But even if he escalates to that level, Iran has thousands of these Shahed drones and other kind of drones, these deeply entrenched missile facilities, so it can keep up that pressure on the Strait of Hormuz, I would argue, indefinitely, most likely.
So imagine we're in a negotiation, Sina, and I'm the American side. I'm not listening to Trump. It's J.D. Vance. It's not Steve Witkoff. And I say, look, we understand that your main objective is to be, to some extent, reintegrated into the regional and global economy. We understand you want to be able to keep this leverage as an insurance policy in the future. We don't like that, but we understand why you want to keep it. We will acknowledge that in exchange for you no longer engaging with support for the likes of Hezbollah or developing domestic nuclear technology. Would that be enough? And I know this is a strange, perhaps silly question, because we're a million miles away from it right now. There aren't meaningful negotiations as far as we understand. But it seems to me that Iran is willing to make potentially quite major concessions on things like nuclear ambitions for what you just described there. And I think maybe a cardinal ranking of what Tehran is really after would be quite useful here. Because, these aren't the things that are explained actually to a mass audience in the UK right now by legacy media.
Yeah, well, this goes back to, what was the strategic logic for the nuclear program in Iran? And I have long argued that the nuclear program, Iran's approach to developing, its nuclear program, it wasn't a covert, program that was aimed at, dashing for the bomb in some mountain. They wanted to build, the whole nuclear fuel cycle infrastructure, from getting the uranium to the yellow cake to building the centrifuges to being able to position themselves to provide, to develop their own nuclear fuel that they need for the nuclear power plant in Bushehr. But what this gave them was, this threshold capacity. It's a dual use technology. So if they have all these centrifuges and these declared facilities to the international community, to the IAEA, that, if they had, this gave them leverage in their mind. So if they wanted to, dash for the bomb, they can, quickly, move to weapons grade uranium and stuff, but they never did that. And so what the program, I think, was a bargaining chip. I mean, it was, aimed at the deterrent function that, we have this threshold capacity, we can dash for the bomb. That didn't work. It was also a bargaining chip where, they showed that they were willing, really ever since 2005, and even before that, in 2003, when Khatami shut down the enrichment program, but that they were willing to trade this threshold capacity for basically strategic accommodation of the Islamic Republic by the great powers, by the US, that since 1979 has been at odds with the system and has pursued sanctions relief in one way. I mean, it's regime change in one way or another. And we can get into that history if you want, but I would argue that is the objective reality of the history of US-Iran relations since 1979. And so, 2015 was a big moment where Iran was willing to give up this bargaining chip in exchange for sanctions relief and the prospect of detente with the US, while at the same time keeping its regional strategic depth, keeping the support for Hezbollah, for Hamas, and that was a big fault, something that many, hawks in the US faulted the deal for. That, Iran is still, we're giving them sanctions relief. Yeah, the nuclear program. I mean, they would argue that the nuclear program wasn't even properly put in check, even though it really was. But, Iran was still supporting these other groups and, building kind of its own sphere of influence in a way in the region. Regardless, now we're in a situation and, a new situation with the Strait of Hormuz has long been something that, people have talked about. Iran couldn't shut it down. It could have all these debilitating knock-on effects, but now they've proven that they can, and they've closed it, despite, as I said, the US throwing everything at them, short of like nuking them or ground invasion. And it's still shut down. They're still launching their missiles. They're still shooting their drones. And this is arguably, many people are arguing this nowadays, that it's a greater deterrent weapon or deterrent kind of means that Iran has, even more so than the nuclear program, even maybe if it had nuclear weapons, because of the global ramifications. So to your point of, what could a deal look like? Will Iran be willing to give up its nuclear program again? I think, the nuclear program, again, viewing it in this bargaining chip idea that the Iranians, I think, had and have had, they were willing, again, to part ways with a lot of these capabilities just before this war. That deal, there was negotiations ongoing just before this war. In Geneva, their last meeting, and according to reports by The Guardian, by Amwaj Media, that there was a deal at hand that was actually stronger for the US than the Obama-era deal. Iran was actually apparently willing to, freeze enrichment, not go back to enrichment in the near term, perhaps in perpetuity. They were going to set up a regional consortium to develop nuclear fuel. So, but that goes to this idea that, they wanted the deterrent function. If they can get a deal, they can get sanctions relief, they can remove the shadow of war from over their heads. They didn't get that with, they didn't get that kind of nuclear deal. But right now, with the Strait of Hormuz potentially changing the strategic landscape, and, the US, that would be a concession to the US giving up the enriched uranium, giving up, maybe some of these nuclear means, going back to that deal that was perhaps on the table. That seems feasible. But what is not feasible is that, Iran is going to, I think, fight with everything it has to maintain this closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because that is the bigger strategic prize for them.
I think this is something which has really not been touched upon by legacy media, by broadcast media. This idea that Iran was developing its nuclear program for two things in response to sanctions and sovereignty. Khomeini had a quote, he had many quotes, of course, often they contradicted one another. But somebody asked him what was the major achievement of the Islamic Revolution. He said that Iran will be governed from Tehran. And I think this reading of the pursuit of nuclear technology, both civilian and potentially militarily, was, of course, part of that bargaining process, trying to create some leverage where you can get these two major things: sovereignty, recognition that Iran is indeed governed from Tehran, and an integration of Iran into the regional and global economy, which to some extent was happening after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, very much comes to an end really by the early 2010s, and the sanctions have just been ratcheted up. Do you think that and by the way, I do buy the argument that the conventional missile program is a better deterrent, maybe, because it can actually be used, than a nuclear one. And that's why this demand that Iran give up its ballistic missile program is just utterly absurd. It's completely unserious, I think, because it's the first time in a very long time that Tehran feels it has something where it can actually exercise influence and agency. Do you think that the IRGC are surprised at how effective this strategy has been with the Strait of Hormuz? Because it almost feels like a tale of two states. On the one hand, you have, on the very first day or two of this conflict, the supreme leader taken out, very senior people in the IRGC taken out. Of course, at the start of the 12-day war last year, a whole layer of senior people in politics and the military taken out. On the other hand, you have incredibly effective strategy being executed by seemingly the same government and same state, which is having huge ramifications for the global economy. I suppose for some people, they'd say, well, this looks quite incompetent, all over the place, doesn't really have a clue. And yet, on the other hand, this looks like a very formidable adversary who we've really underestimated. So I suppose, why is that bifurcation there? Is it real? And like I say, have the IRGC surpassed their own expectations? Are they shocked almost with the amount of influence all of a sudden they have over global markets?
They very well may be. I mean, because one interesting thing I've been seeing, just Iranian analysts writing about, people in the Iranian media, even IRGC, people affiliated with the IRGC, is that they're even surprised by. And you can read it in between the lines, just them being able to hold on in this fashion, like you said, despite all these assassinations, and having, their base, the base of the Islamic Republic has been in the streets, and even beyond that base. And at some point, because we often view these things as, in the West, in the cliched kind of view of these societies or of the Iranian government, in this very simplistic way of, it's an authoritarian, totalitarian state. They don't have any supporters, or, they bribe people to come out or whatever. But, Iran has politics. It's complex. And it's not always the case that, there's some political leaders that are driving those events. Many times it's a society, and it's, in this case, the base of the country, of the Islamic Republic, and, Iranians who just want, like, as you say, harkening back to this history of this quest for sovereignty and national independence that goes, precedes the Islamic Republic by decades, over a century, really. Iran, that this country that, much like, elsewhere in the global South, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, that has come under, European colonialism in the past couple centuries. Iran lost a lot of territory. Iran lost its, autonomy. And much like China, we talk about a century of humiliation in China, same in Iran, and so this quest for sovereignty is a real thing that has influenced Iranian politics, and that the Islamic Republic has hedged a lot of its legitimacy on, despite its repression, despite its social and political restrictions that have, shed a lot of diplomacy legitimacy for it since 1979. This is the one thing it's held on very tightly to. And we've seen that in these moments where, it's a gamble for them too. It's ultimately a gamble. They killed Khamenei, they killed the head of the Revolutionary Guards, they killed all these officials, and no one there knows 100%, we're going to hold on and stuff. But then, people come to the streets and in big numbers, and so they can maintain their base. They can, and even beyond that, again, I would argue. And so I think that is a big driving factor for Iran's resilience and its national security strategy. The Iranians, in preparing for this war, their whole national security strategy was based on the threat perception of U.S. and or Israeli attack against them for decades. This has been their military doctrine. And so even, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas, you get into the security dilemma, what factors came first. But regardless, Iran built this infrastructure, especially since the 90s, and especially, again, after the 2003 Iraq war, to deter a U.S. or Israeli attack and be able to raise, be able to inflict a cost upon them if they attack Iran. And so they built that infrastructure, and they especially learned a lot of lessons after the June war. So in terms of them being able to operate despite these assassinations, one of the things they've done in this interim period between June 2025 and this February war, this war that started in February, was dispersing this strategy is called the mosaic strategy, or mosaic kind of defense doctrine. A lot of it was explicitly stated. And the most important aspect of this was dispersing the military and political officials and infrastructure, and having, predetermined war plans, and that didn't rely on centralized decision making that like on a day-to-day basis. Not to say that that's eliminated, but you can they basically had these local commanders, local IRGC, local military, army in different parts of Iran that are acting, they have a set of instructions and plans, and again, this is stuff the Iranians have written about themselves, and each official has designated multiple successors. So yes, on one hand, you have clear intelligence infiltration by the Israelis. There's a large degree of it seems to be signals intelligence, technological superiority that they have, in this era where people can be tracked, based on the typing patterns that they have on their keyboard, based on Wi-Fi signals, like if you read some of these interesting kind of tech blogs and stuff about where that kind of scary surveillance stuff is going, that they can basically figure out through Wi-Fi signals where someone is based on their habits. So, I mean, my point is that there's a big technological gap that they can use to identify, I think, where some of these people are at. There's certainly a human intelligence angle and infiltration. But at the same time, the resilience of the system comes from it being entrenched, it having a base of support, and it adapting in the face of these pressures. So we've seen that, again, since there was many assassinations last summer, they took out the entire military echelon, the chief of staff, the head of the IRGC, they were all replaced. Iran fought that war, emerged from it. Same thing in this war. Again, many assassinations, but they've developed this system where they have successors, they've spread them around. And ultimately, the root of the resilience, I would argue, comes from that they do have a base of support and these ideas of national sovereignty and this ideology that has kind of kept the system going, and the one thing that they've stuck to, despite, a system that is otherwise very unpopular, that has shed a lot of legitimacy. But this is the one thing that they've held onto that has maintained, their base.
Yeah, it does feel that the sort of main tools of the Iranian government, the IRGC, is the fact that the IRGC is a revolutionary organization which ties itself to the masses, and that's not where it draws its power from. I mean, in the coming weeks and months, we could see Iraqi militias going into Kuwait. We could see some kind of attempt at a coup d'etat in Bahrain. And that is tied to a political culture of dissent, which is not an elite culture in those places. Which, again, I think just by virtue of how we think about politics and government in Britain, Europe, North America, that's a very hard thing to understand, but it's very, very real. Before all this happened, there was a cottage industry of Iranian influencers saying that actually only 10% of the country supports the Islamic Republic. I mean, that's just not true. Doesn't have to be a majority, but it's certainly not 10% either. Only 10% of the country supports the Islamic Republic. You just need to go in, you need to bomb a few places, kill a few people, and it'll fall over as if the wind had just blown very lightly. Do you think that Washington and Tel Aviv believed that line? Do you think they were victims in a way of their own propaganda?
Yes, I mean, I'm here in Washington, and I've seen this in real time and, up close, how this idea became entrenched that Iran is a paper tiger, that this regime is very weak and brittle, and with one more push, it'll collapse. And to a certain degree, I think this derived from Iran's strategy in recent years, where its responses to US and Israeli escalations were fairly measured and calibrated. Iran had this strategy of strategic patience, where it was an implicit strategy, where when the US left the nuclear deal, for example, Iran stayed 100% within its confines and its limitations for a year afterwards, only then started gradually leaving the confines of that deal, expanding its stockpiles of enriched uranium and whatnot, trying to negotiate with the Europeans. When America assassinated Qasem Soleimani in 2020, Iran didn't, many people thought it would trigger a big war or, some kind of bigger conflict, but Iran's retaliation was fairly measured. It attacked the base hosting US troops in Iraq, and it gave warning ahead of time. The base was largely evacuated or people were in bunkers, but nevertheless, it did destroy that base largely. We know that after the fact, according to reporting that has been done by US media. But we've seen, in the tit for tat strikes with Israel, Israel's been assassinating a lot of Iranian military figures throughout the region and scientists and other officials in the country. But Iran either had no response or a very restrained response, or you had those tit for tat missile strikes against Israel in 2024. I would argue that those Iranian responses were not inconsequential. I think many people, especially the Israel lobby and very hawkish neoconservative groups in Washington, they made a concerted effort to downplay those Iranian responses because I would argue they wanted to build the political case to get Washington in this war, that, war with Iran would be costless, it would be easy. So they were like, these Iranian missiles, they're weak, they're ineffective, they're inaccurate, they can't really do any damage. This regime is very weak. So basically you had two things happen. One was where Iran's responses to US escalations in the past 10 years were calibrated, but not inconsequential. But the very hawkish forces in Washington and Israel and the Israel lobby here made a concerted effort to really downplay those Iranian responses, to portray it as much weaker than it was. And so what we had that, yes, I think Trump is someone who is he famously does not listen to his military and intelligence briefings. We know he's surrounded by sycophants and yes men who are basically afraid to criticize him or raise any criticism and just say what he wants to hear. And so it was really a perfect storm where he was led into this war. I'm sure, Netanyahu came here in January, came here again in February, selling him on this war, and Trump has said that we didn't think they were going to hit back in the Gulf. We didn't think, they clearly thought they can get a Venezuela type situation. And even though this stuff was telegraphed from Iran, again, their military doctrine is explicitly changed. It's not a secret. It's in the public domain. They said they were going to hit back in the region. The Strait of Hormuz has long been viewed as Iran's key leverage. But I think, it was a perfect storm of these various factors aligning, and Trump being this perfect person to execute what Netanyahu has wanted for decades, this US war on Iran. But again, they hit a wall. They miscalculated and they hit a wall. And now he's in this kind of strategic deadlock, he's threatening this kind of catastrophic escalation scenario.
I suppose I want to dig a bit deeper there, though. Why did they hit a wall? Because, I wrote an article a year ago. I'm not a particularly intelligent or well-informed person. I read outlets and newspapers and magazines, but I have very few, private sources in Tehran or Tel Aviv or Washington or London or Brussels, right? But even I was able to write an article saying this would be insane. Iran's military doctrine of self-defense is based around asymmetric warfare, both proxies in terms of forward defense, but also things like shutting down the Strait of Hormuz using UAVs, Siraj speedboats, autonomous torpedoes. They will be able to sustain a lot more. The idea of a national sacrifice economy will endure probably more than global markets will be able to take a pummeling, or will endure longer than we can afford to have oil at $200 a barrel. I said all of that 12 months ago. Many other people did too, of course. We had Vali Nasser on this show right at the top of the conflict saying, exactly that. And yet there was nobody in Washington saying this. And I kind of want to know why. Do you think it's because of the ideological commitments to Zionism within this administration? What is it? I mean, it just seems so at odds with half a century of US statecraft. The US hasn't done this precisely because it knew everything that has now happened would likely happen, yet Trump is the exception. Why is that?
Yes, well, I actually tried to touch on this issue in a recent article I wrote for The Nation, and I kind of blamed it on kind of textbook decision-making failures, both at a micro level with Trump and a macro level in kind of the DC foreign policy establishment. And these are, issues of groupthink, confirmation bias, and the influence of, donors and political special interest groups and kind of shaping this debate. So there's many angles to this. I mean, if you look at the Iran policy of Trump, how it's been shaped, the groups that are influencing it. I mean, Trump is someone who his number one donor in 2016 was Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson was the late casino magnate billionaire, and his wife is Miriam Adelson, this Israeli woman. And he himself had said publicly, Israel's my number one issue. I would rather my son serve in the IDF than the US military. And interestingly, Sheldon Adelson himself had said that we should nuke Iran. He said this back in like 2013 or something. Regardless, this is important because, he was Trump's number one donor. He had these kind of political operatives and donors around him from the get-go, having his ear. Obviously, we know in his inner decision-making circle. I mean, we can see it, with these negotiations with Iran that were ongoing that turned out to be a farce. It was led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Both are devout Zionists. Jared Kushner comes from a family that is very close to Netanyahu. He himself has said that, when I was young, Netanyahu would come over to our place and sleep in my bed. So you have this situation where this administration is very close to the most hawkish of the Israel lobby, because the Israel lobby is many different groups, special interest groups, think tanks, donors. But this is the most extreme of the extreme, the Sheldon Adelsons and, these kind of figures. And you couple that with a DC foreign policy establishment in which Iran has long been a boogeyman. Politically, Iran is easily able to be demonized. It's had this kind of position of a enemy in U.S. kind of political psyche and body politic for decades now. And, for politicians, it's hard to kind of have nuance about Iran. It's all in a black and white view. And then you have a DC foreign policy establishment, the blob, as Ben Rhodes called it, that, is heavily funded by foreign interests explicitly, like whether that be the Gulf countries, whether that be, these connections to Israel. And this perpetuation of these narratives that are very simplistic, black and white about Iran, about Iranian capabilities. I just talked about, how their military capabilities were understated and downplayed even during this period of, their calibrated responses. But, the incentive was to perpetuate conflict and to increase conflict. Because, if you look at these donors, the Israel lobby donors, and who they support, Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, the hawkish pro-Israel think tanks in Washington, D.C. that have had a lot of influence over the Trump administration, such as the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, United Against Nuclear Iran, the Washington Institute. These are organizations that have long sought U.S. war with Iran. They've argued for it. They wanted it. We can argue, it's for Israeli interest. It's for, some kind of hawkish American imperialist interests. But they've managed to dominate the debate, especially in the Trump era, and perpetuate these narratives. And so that's where they got locked into groupthink and confirmation bias and believing their own propaganda. Where sometimes you'll have, and I see this every day, it's kind of like one of these hawkish pro-Israel think tanks, one of their analysts says something, some friendly journalist or something echoes that, some Trump official echoes that, or like gives it to Barack Ravid and he'll say something. So at the end of the day, what you do have is not good decision-making that is good for any rational definition of American interests. Mm. What you get is locked into, groupthink, confirmation bias, all of these textbook psychological issues that prevent good decision-making. And you wind up walking into this quagmire that was very predictable, that many people had predicted it, but they weren't listening to those people.
So you're in Washington. I think this is a great place to end the conversation on. I've had a theory for quite a long time that foreign policy as a subject, as an area, and I don't mean to offend anybody who's immersed in foreign policy. It's an important thing to know about and inform people about. But it's, for me, the area where you see the most elite overproduction. And if you go back, of course, to the 50s and the 60s, you didn't have people like the Atlantic Council. Of course, it existed, but it didn't have hundreds of fellows. I think the Atlantic Council has over 200 members of staff. You didn't have all these organizations with all these fellows and all these people making all these arguments. And I won't say names, but there are some quite high-profile people who've been very hawkish on war with Iran, who were very wrong, many of whom aren't even from the United States. And it seems to me it's the perfect field in terms of elite overproduction, people coming out with a humanities degree. They want to play status games, And of course, if you're from a middle or upper class background, you're not that interested in money. You're interested in status. And foreign policy seems to be the place many of those people end up. And I feel like it's not something we talk about. You don't get people going into economic policy or housing policy or law and order for those reasons. You see it time after time, however, with foreign policy because of the potential glamour, because of the perceived high stakes and so on, because of the internationalist element, of course, inherently attached to it. Do you think we should just get rid of all these think tanks? Do you think something needs to be done in terms of not just interest representation, interest capture, but the fact you just have this whole industry, which, like I say, seems to be based to a significant degree on elite overproduction?
Yes, well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with this issue of elite overproduction, which, historically leads to all kinds of problems and potential conflict and, in some societies, even civil war. But, in terms of, it is status seeking, like you're saying. And because the status that in Washington, because it's been so heavily dominated by these hawkish groups and donors, and that's been the landscape. So it's created this incentive structure where, you have this elite overproduction, you have these people want status and whatnot, and then the incentive structure, the pipelines that exist, push them in this direction of like hawkish foreign policy, perpetuating these conflicts and getting America entangled in these quagmires abroad because of all these incentive structures that lead to people perpetuating or being it in their own self-interest and for their own personal ambition to perpetuate these things that I think many of them know are wrong. It's not difficult to look at the history of American foreign policy in the modern era, just since 9/11, and reach the conclusion that these wars in the Middle East, America's misadventures in the Middle East have been incredibly costly, haven't done anything for the American people's security, prosperity, what should underpin ideas of the national interest in America. And yet, I think because of these factors, that has not been the case. So yes, to your point, I think we need a reset or to really revisit in this country and in Europe too, and in the UK as well, like how we approach our foreign policy decision making, how that landscape is shaped, and the incentive structure to not perpetuate bad policies that ultimately are hurting us, are hurting people in America, are hurting economic growth, development, prosperity, security, growing the American middle class. There's very compelling arguments based on vast amounts of evidence and experience that these kind of military interventions abroad, and now it's reached the point where Trump is threatening to end Iranian civilization, and God knows where we're going to go from here, that this is not obviously in any rational definition of American interest. So to your point, yeah, I mean, the whole incentive structure is messed up in Washington, D.C. when it comes to deciding foreign policy.